Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining today's webinar hosted by AMCHAM's ESG Committee. I'm Una Claire Kim, Director of Government and Corporate Affairs at AMCHAM, and I'm very pleased to kick off today's webinar. AMCHAM's ESG Committee was launched in March 2021 with the goal to promote ESG best practices and foster dialogue between the US and Korea in the ESG space. Thanks in large part to the excellent leadership shown by our ESG Committee co-chairs, the committee has been spearheading the effort to advance important ESG-related dialogues. Starting with today's webinar, the ESG Committee will be offering a bi-monthly ESG Talk Series to highlight best practices in different aspects of ESG. In today's webinar, Dow will share its journey and best practices in promoting the social aspect of ESG, particularly inclusion, diversity, and equity. In terms of logistics, Andrew Ryu, Country Manager and General Counsel for Dow Korea and our ESG Committee Co-Chair, will introduce today's speaker, Curtis Baker, Dow's Asia Pacific Regional Lead for Inclusion and Diversity. And Curtis will give a presentation for about 30 minutes. After that, we will have an audience Q&A, so please feel free to submit your questions by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. With that, Andrew, let me hand it over to you.
Thank you. So let me start by giving you a brief summary of what the committee has done. So as far as the membership of co-chair is concerned, is Dow, represented by me, and then we have 3M, Jim Faltisai, and we also have P&G as part of the three-person co-chair. We started the committee April 2021, as you can see in the slide. First event we held was in 2021 May, where we had a joint US-Korea ESG forum, which we held in partnership with FKI. In October 2021, we had a first webinar where we had ESG and supply chain discussions. I think I moderated that one. And then we had another one in May 2022, where we held a webinar with the topic of recent ESG trends and ESG webinar with Korea Productivity Center. And then we are holding our first talk series, as Claire mentioned, where Dow, 3M, and P&G will take turns in a bi-monthly presentation. And after that, I think we'll open it up to other companies that are interested in sharing their ESG journey, ESG updates, best practices. So with that, let me first introduce Curtis. Curtis is, as Claire mentioned, Regional Inclusion and Diversity and Employee Experience Lead for Asia Pacific for Dow. In his combined role, Curtis is responsible for driving and implementing inclusion and diversity and employee experience strategy and providing expertise, consultation, and support to business, functional, and ERG leaders. ERG stands for Employee Resource Group. So that's the organizations we set up under, and Curtis will get into it, to encourage inclusion, diversity, and equity. We have 10 globally, and I'll leave it to Curtis to go over that. Curtis currently lives in China. He's been living in China since 2013. And last time I checked, he still loves living in Asia. I think he intends to live in Asia for a while longer. So we love having you in Asia, Curtis. Curtis also is an avid fan of Korean drama. He, I think, watches more than I do, and he loves Korean food. So our original intent was to do this in a live session in Korea, but a lot of logistical difficulties that didn't happen. So we're doing it online. I want to thank everyone for joining. So Curtis, let me turn it over to you now for your presentation.
Thanks so much, Andrew. And yes, and good morning, everyone. Hope you're having a great day. It's a nice, beautiful fall, autumn day here in Shanghai. So, and thank you to AMCHAM. Thanks for the opportunity just to be able to just share a little bit about our Dow journey. So as Andrew mentioned, I am based here in Shanghai with Dow leading for the Asia Pacific region. And what we're going to do today is we're really going to just talk to you a little bit. What I want to do is just to share with you. I'm very laid back, and so we, as Claire had mentioned as well, please do ask questions because I think that's the best way that we can learn. ESG is such a buzzword, and I think we have to also acknowledge that in our market in Asia Pacific, there's a different understanding, and there's some cultural elements and aspects to that. So what we're going to do today is just a brief introduction of who is Dow, and what is ESG, and then look at why ESG is important for us. And we'll talk specifically, I want to focus on the S, that's more on my scope, which it does impact the E and the G, but really looking at the S, the social aspect of that, through the lens of inclusion, diversity, and equity. And then we'll look at some intentional actions that we've taken within Dow around ESG, including, as Andrew's mentioned, what our ERGs are doing as well about intentional actions. And then really to just open up to any questions that you may have, because again, I do believe that asking those questions can really help us to understand, where this is, especially that we are an American company, but we're operating in Asia Pacific and specifically here in Korea. So let me just go ahead and begin to share my my presentation here for you. And so we'll get started. So perfect. So again, my name's Curtis. So really looking, who is Dow? I think if you have an Apple phone right now, you have a product that has Dow in it. If you're wearing some of your Nike shoes or Nike apparel right now, you have a product that is impacted by Dow. If you're wearing your Crocs at home and walking around comfortably in your Crocs outside, then you have a product that's in Dow. And a lot of it, if you're in a construction, if you have the silicone around your building so far, you have the silicone around your windows, then you have a product that is in Dow. So the great thing is that Dow is in everything, but we are a B2B company. And then last year, our record global sales are around $55 billion US. Globally, we have about almost 36,000 employees at the manufacturing sites, 104 globally. And with a global reach, we do operate in 31 countries around the world. And this just gives you a little bit of a picture here. So here in Asia Pacific, you see us operating in manufacturing in 10 countries. And those sites, we do have 3 sites within our Korea site there. So, but we're not here so much to talk about this, but really want to just dive straight into looking at, what is ESG? And so ESG is environmental, social, and governance. And sometimes, I think especially for multinationals, we use a lot of these acronyms, we use a lot of these words. What is ESG? Is the S sustainable, but no, it's social. And so environmental, social, and governance. So never want to assume that everyone has the same understanding with that. But what does that look like? What does each one of those pillars look like? So under environmental, we look at how we're impacting, or what is our impact on the planet through climate protection, through the way, that we're producing waste and controlling waste and recycling and reusing the waste, and using also our water and our biodiversity. And then for our focus today, really looking under the S, under the social. And so it's really about the culture part of that, both internally and externally. And how do we treat people? How do we treat our people? How do we treat our families? How do we treat our employees? But how do we also treat our communities and the places where we work and where we develop and grow as a business? So how do we treat our people through inclusion, diversity, and equity? So this is in my role, but also looking at that from a customer satisfaction or a CX opportunity as well. And then we look at that also through employee engagement, engagement in our purpose. I think post-COVID, or as we're starting to come out of COVID, employee engagement, employee experience is super top of the priorities that's trending within the market, especially looking at 2023. There is a shift and how employee experience is more of a holistic approach, and how that does impact the S of ESG. And also looking at those community relations and then human rights and labor standards where applicable, so forth. And then looking under the government model, how do we do this? And then looking for our board diversity and composition, executive composition, and pay ethics, and then data security. So when we look at ESG, these are kind of some more laid back, easy, relatable terms. So again, we're going to really focus today and share with you really about how we treat our people, but knowing that that does also impact our environmental and our governance, et cetera, and so forth. So as I said, why is ESG important? It's such a big buzzword, and to me, I find that for even with Dow, we have previously published a sustainability report. We published our IND report. And companies have all reported different papers, what you're doing, what you're advancing on. But what's really nice is about ESG brings it all together into one really keen focus, but it also brings a lot of weight into one paper. Our ESG report is called Intersections. It's nice because it brings all of these together into one nice, clear, concise way to move forward. But ESG does have a competitive advantage when you look at both the financial aspects, the financial benefits, and what it brings also to the company and reputation and value and branding. But then also there's the benefits and also looking at the talent pipeline. So just a couple of statistics here. We look at that companies with a strong ESG rating will generally have a return over 400 points base higher than their competitor. And through executing some of these ESG strategies, when done with intentionality, we can see profits based, over 60%. And I can tell you last year that for Dow, we had our highest revenue base and our highest sales and gross in the country's 125-year history. What was interesting about that is that also, if we look at the metrics, our financials were great, with cash flow, with sales and so forth, profit. But then if we look at the flip side of that, we also had the best year ever that we've had is when we were measuring our inclusion, diversity, and equity metrics. So we had the most engaged of our employee resource groups, our ERGs. So we had the most of our employees ever that we've had that were enrolled into an ERG. We had the most people leaders of our people leaders and management, those who are leading others that were engaged in an employee resource group. We had the highest level of female representation in the company thus far. And with an industry like us in the science, materials, and manufacturing, that's a constant struggle. But also not just representation, but also female leadership in that. So we had the highest percentage of female leadership globally. And we also outspent and overachieved our diverse spending. We were targeted for $200 million US, and we actually accumulated over 220 spend on that. So it's no longer a business case in that way. It's actually fact. When you have engaged employees, you have engaged, those who are engaged, you have a great employee experience, then that directly relates to the performance of the team, also the performance of the individual, and that brings the profits again for the company. And then we can also look at, as I just mentioned, employees are 85% more likely to work for a company as well that has its environment and governance values. We're seeing a shift in the market, where the Gen Z and millennials really want to say, I want to work for a company that matches my personal values a little bit. That what are we doing about the environment? What is this company that I may potentially take the offer for doing about equity, about benefits, et cetera? And we look at employees that are also 83% more likely to work for a company that has standards for social values. So where are companies standing up for gender equity and equality, for LGBT rights, for marriage equality, for we're looking at the aging population, et cetera. So companies are looking for, and employees are looking for companies that are making those stands. And now multinationals, I think, especially in Asia Pacific, have more of an opportunity to share, but then also the employees are expecting more of their employers to make those stands as well. And then lastly, here we see that organizations with the highest employee satisfaction, so getting that pulse on how our employees feel, the sentiment, their performance, not just about what they're doing, but also their sentiment of how they feel proud or how they feel inspired or that they belong at their company. They have a 14% higher average ESG scores when we have a higher employee sentiment there. So these are some of the talks about the ESG as a competitive advantage here. So why it's important and how there's the return of investment, not just for a charity, but there is a purpose and there's a business case, and it does attach to the bottom line. I love this quote that our CFO, our president and CFO, Howard says, he goes, and he gets very excited about this. He says, ESG isn't just something that we do, but it's literally everything that we do, and everything, it's how we do it. And I love that it's about the how. And that's something that I want to share with you a little bit today about the how and about the why with us at Dow. So for us in Dow, we look at our ESG and we actually have our priorities bucketed here into 4 different focuses. And so this is directly a page that came from our latest ESG report, which was released previous this year and in the summer. You can find this online as well. It's available, but our ESG report focuses on these 4 strategic areas. So, of course, we have our environmental performance, looking at decarbonization and growth and looking at how we are moving forward with that, but also how are we giving back and make sure that we're taking care, in emitting some of those carbon in the environment as well and moving forward. But then also looking at inclusion, diversity, and equity and community. So these 2 buckets actually roll up into the S, looking at, what are we doing on purpose? as we move forward. The market, again, the work market is changing. Employees are asking different things for their employers, are requiring more. I think this is something that COVID has really spotlighted as well. But we know that it really does, for an industry, especially like ours, where we're talking about innovation and technology, that you really do need that diverse workforce that brings this wide range of fresh perspectives, that thinking outside of the box, that challenging, but it's also about bringing diverse perspectives globally, bringing those into the business and into the office. It's also taking that into the community, which is the third pillar here. So that, we also want to make sure that where we are working, where we are doing business, both with our employees and with our customers and with our families as well. It's also about positive change. Where are we making an impact, where we work and where we live, and looking at for a more sustainable future, both in environmental sustainability, but also for an employee sustainability. How are we making sure that we're keeping our employees for the long run, so that when we talk about lower retention? And then lastly, looking at corporate governance, just making sure that we have that best in class that strengthens, not only from the top down, but also from the bottom up. And we'll share a little bit more about that here in just a second. But so how do we do that? So again, now I'm going to bring it a focus and really focus on our inclusion, diversity, and equity journey. So in last year, we really did kind of an update in inclusion, diversity, and equity. So ID&E. Now, some folks call it DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some call it diversity and inclusion, or EDI. So you're going to hear all of these different types of acronyms. And for Dow, we're calling it diversity and inclusion. But we took the intentional action of actually flipping that around and putting inclusion first. So that's where we get our inclusion, diversity, and equity. And why did we do that? Inclusion is action. So inclusion is the action part of it. And so when we take those inclusive actions, then we will get the diversity. And the diversity is our numbers. That's who we are. And once we have that put in, so we have the action of the inclusive practices, actions, and mindsets, and the way we do business, then we bring in that diverse talent. And then equity is really how we play. And equity is different than equality. Equity is really being fair. So sometimes there are things that we may need to do for different demographics of diversity and elevating and working forward, so that we can make sure that everyone has a fair opportunity. And so we outlined it in last year, kind of repivoted ourselves to look at our all-inclusion or ID&E strategy in these 7 buckets. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these into very deep, because I want to make sure that we have some questions, some Q&A to have this dialogue, but really to look at, this is what guides us all the way through 2025, that we meet those goals that we have at. So we'll look at governance, and so in the instituting for us, our all-in strategy, the goal, let me back up one second here. Our goal is that by 2025, Dow is a global leader in valuing inclusion, workforce diversity, and fairness for all. So our goal is to be the most innovative, customer-centric, inclusive, and sustainable science materials company in the world. And the way that we're going to do that is through our all-in 2025 strategy. And so looking at these 7 pillars, we look at governance. And governance is important, in how that we institute inclusive culture, as well as inclusive and equitable practices throughout all of our organization. And how does that look down? That looks like a top-down approach. So we have commitments from our board and our leadership team, looking at, is our board, is our leadership team, is our C-suite that's sitting in Midland Mission, are they all truly diverse? And we're getting better and better with that. But looking at also that we established our Chief Inclusion Officer, which is Karen S. Carter, who I have the pleasure of being under that team. But I don't sit under HR, I actually sit under the Office of Inclusion. So taking that intentional action of even calling out ID&E is so important in our structure, in our mission, and our vision, and our values. We have the Office of Inclusion, which is a separate function tied into HR, but focuses on driving this. And the Office of Inclusion is just one pillar and one key player within the ESG strategy. And then we have 3 different councils that have to oversee our inclusion councils here. So we have our President's Council, which is mainly made up of our C-suite. We also have our senior leaders, which is more of a global perspective. So we have those regional presidents and regional senior commercial and business leaders. And then we also have our Joint Inclusion Council, which we bring in our global employee resource group leaders, or our ERG leaders, along with our regional inclusion leaders, which is myself, is on that. So we have those 3 different councils that help to move the narrative forward. And that also does include our ESG network, So it's not just only, our IND, but it's also looking at our supplier diversity team, looking at our sustainability team, and again, bringing these three voices all together to move forward, and as well as our community aspect with our Dow Foundation. So it's one thing to have the top down, if Jim Fidling, our CEO, says ID&E is not just, what we do, it is really who we are. And so that's the top down, but to make sure that it's also coming up from the bottom up, and looking at these inclusive metrics. And I'll share some of these exact metrics with you in just a moment. But what we do is we measure it, make sure, because what you measure really does matter. And so if you look at, when you're investing enough money into ID&E and that social aspect, it's really important to make sure that you're measuring so you can see progress, you see what's working, what's not working. And we're a science materials company, so we measure everything. There's lots of data in that. So for example, one of the things that we look at female representation. We measure female representation globally. Then we also look at not only just representation within the company, but also at female leadership, people leaders, and measure that percentage. We also look at our employee resource group participation rate. So how many of our employees are involved and engaged in an employee resource group? And I'll share with you more about our employee resource groups as well. But then also not just our employees, but also there's a leadership accountability. Part of that governance and part of the people leaders pillar here is that how many of our people leaders are involved in an employee resource group? Because if our leaders are not leading, then it's really hard for the rest of our teams to move forward. So those are some of the metrics that we have in place, and we measure those as well. And that's tied into performance award. In 2020, it was only tied to about 300 of our top senior leaders, but in 2021, we really took that accountability and put that even further to almost 3,000 of our people leaders and that is tied into our performance award. That's about 20% of our global annual performance award. So we also look at, we talked about engagement and looking at the employee experience, employee engagement. So we do an annual employee survey called The Voice, which we're currently in the process of gathering that data right now, just to make sure that we're keeping the track. How are employees feeling? We're very specific with asking, do you feel like you're proud? Do you feel like you belong? Do you feel like your manager helps with you with work-related stress? How are your tools, your technology, your processes? So look at all of the employee experience. So do you feel valued? Do you feel like you have a psychologically safe workplace and team to work on? So looking to see those, and what happens is then we pull that data, we get that quarterly and kind of a pulse check, but globally we do this once a year to pull that employee experience survey to get that feedback and to take actions upon that. And that's how we move forward. And that's where some of these pillars came from, through those voice. And then our volunteer groups with our employee resource groups, having those grassroots, but seeing that our employee resource groups are a great way for development of opportunity, and seeing more importantly too, that Team Dow is engaged and empowered really to advance inclusion. It's really about that empowerment. We sit on those core values within the company, really allowing the trust, transparency, accountability, and empowerment to drive the culture. So we talked a little bit about the governance there a little bit, but also looking at our customers. How are we positively impacting our customer experience? You may say, well, how does ID&E impact our customers? I can tell you here, especially even in Shanghai, we've had some of our customers say, hey, I've heard about your employee resource groups. Can you help our company? Can you help us become mentor? And so the word is getting out, but also, we see the impact of employee resources. So how do we partner with our customers, and how do we help them along their journey as well, to make sure that they're also having an inclusive journey and an inclusive workplace? We're also looking at talent and improving the diversity and the capability of our workforces, and making sure. And that we know that by 2025, research is showing us that by 2025, 75% of the workforce could potentially be full of millennials and Gen Z. So if we're looking at that workforce, then we also must see, they're also asking for employers and for companies to think differently. It goes back to Adam Grant, think again. You have to think differently, that they are really valuing more of a holistic approach to work. It's not just I come in, I get a paycheck and I leave. They're expecting a better benefit. They're expecting more on environmental. They're expecting more on inclusivity and equitable benefits, but also wanting more flexibility within their workspace. Where can I work remotely? How can I work from home? And so when this workforce becomes something that we as companies have to pivot and have to hear that. Otherwise, we're going to be struggling looking for that. So looking at the talent, but it's not only about who we're recruiting, but it's also about how we're retaining our talent. look at some of those equitable practices. So for us, one of those practices is that we use a neutral interviewer. And this came out of Asia Pacific. And this is actually something that I'm proud of, that out of Asia Pacific we developed. It's actually influencing the rest of Dow globally. And so what is a neutral interviewer? When you think about the talent process, you may have one or two people in that interview process, especially for a manager or people leader or higher level position. And so what we do is we bring in that neutral interviewer. So this is someone from one of our employee resource groups, it could be someone from another business or function that has no direct correlation to the candidate or to that business or function. But they come in and they help to see on that interview panel, make sure that there are no biases handled or there are no biases mentioned during the interview process. So they're really looking for the other two interviewers to make sure that it's an equitable and it's a neutral and it's an unbiased interview process, given that. And so this is one way, again, where we talk about accountability and transparency within even the interview process that impact that talent and that interview process. So when we look again at people leaders, we really to cultivate with our people leaders, and the people leaders are there put in the center for a very important reason, because the people leaders really drive the inclusion, diversity, equity culture within Dow. Inclusion is everything. It's in our DNA. And what I love is some, oftentimes our business leaders say, hey, I'm having a quarterly powwow with the teams, or I'm having a quarterly meeting. Can we talk about, can you help us to come in and really dig into inclusion, to dig into something, or how can we talk more about microaggressions within our team so that we can build better, or how can we talk more about psychological safety within it? So our people leaders are really important. And this is where we we do not have that requirement that people leaders are part of an employee resource group, but it's kind of an expectation that if you want to really lead, then you need to be engaged and involved into the ID&E journey, inclusion, diversity, and equity. But then we look at it as suppliers, and this is something that's really special for within Asia Pacific and really targets with our Korea market, is that we'll look at with the supplier diversity, and I'll talk about it in just a little bit in a moment, but how we even extend that, not just to our customers, but where we spend our money. When we're spending money on purpose and in intentionality, we have that opportunity to impact the community, which leads into that next one. And one of our biggest diverse spends is actually with a company, a small enterprise that's based in South Korea, that really helps to make sure that the risk of sometimes having a diverse supplier is that sometimes you spend so much money and you really help to grow that business that they no longer become a smaller business if they actually get outside of that. So that's one of the positive risks of supplier diversity when we look at small businesses. But supplier diversity, again, we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. It's really how do we help those businesses that are certified or they're female-owned, people with disabilities or people with different abilities owned, LGBTQ owned, or even in Asia Pacific, we have it different where it's a small business owned, that it's the tax credit for that is given to the government, et cetera. So that's where we have that focus, because we know that we can make an impact in those communities. And that's where we strengthen those communities, where we live and where we work. And ultimately all of this comes out and kind of a byproduct on that reputation. If we want to be a global leader and leading ID&E, then we have to work on that reputation. It's not just talking the talk, but it's also walking the walk. And so I've talked a little bit about how we do some of those talks, and this is one part of the social part of that. And so of our ID&E journey, one key pillar for us and one key social aspect of that is our employee resource groups. So as Andrew was mentioned earlier, globally we have 10 employee resource groups, and currently in Asia Pacific we have 8 of those. Because they're not all relevant to our market and to our region. So we have our Women's Inclusion Network. We'll start at the top here and go across. We have our Women's Inclusion Network, which is really about edifying, but creating that sense of community for our females and our allies, so our male allies, to help advance to build that sense of community. We have our Asian Diversity Network, and when I first joined Dow, it was interesting because our employees resource groups were saying, no, but we're all Asians. I said, yes, but we're not all. For example, we're not all Han Chinese, we're not all Korean, we're not all Singaporean, so even within Asia, we have that diversity. And it's looking at how do we look at within Asia Pacific, how do we look at ethnicity differently? How do we look at regions differently? Someone may be from Seoul, but will have a different probably opportunities than they have if they're from Xinjiang, et cetera. And that's our Asian Diversity Network. We also have our Disability Employee Network, which focuses on people with disabilities and allies. And by the way, this isn't National or Global International Disability Month, and making sure that to be aware of those folks with disabilities as well. And how do we look at people with disabilities and bringing them in? This is an opportunity, I think, with us in Asia Pacific we don't see hiring people with disabilities as charity, but really see how do we make sure that we bridge that gap so that we having and giving those opportunities that are fair and equitable to everyone. And we have to really break those biases that someone with a disability is visible disability or whether it's an invisible disability. How can we do that? How can we make our employer, make our companies much better in that and being more inclusive and accessible employee resource groups or companies? So we also look at some more of our cultural aspects of it. We have GAN, which are Global African Affinity Network for us. And so we do have our operations in Africa. So how do we work with that? How do we work with our employees and how do we work, because there are cultural differences that focuses on that aspect. GLAD is for LGBTQ plus. Here in Asia Pacific, we can be sometimes culturally, maybe some of be a little bit more sensitive. We don't see, but with our LGBT, and this actually just Tuesday was National Coming Out Day. So, how do we make sure that our employees that identify with the LGBT community or that they have friends or family or children who are part of the LGBT community, how do we feel like they feel that they are valued, that they belong? We look at, we'll be launching at the end of this year, our Hispanic Latin network, because yes, we do have some of our employees within the region that are from these countries. So how do we elevate and learn more about their country, their culture, as well as MENA, which is our Middle East, North African. And two here at the bottom, we don't have a vet net, which you see on the right here, and that's more around veterans, because it really not as relevant to us here. But we have Prime, which is for our employees who are 50 and above. And then we have Rise, which is for our employees who are just starting their career. Maybe this is their first job out of college, and they are getting started, or they're within 8 years. So these are our employee resource groups. They have their own government, they have their own strategy, they have their own mission and vision and setup. Our employee resource groups really drive a lot, and it's also a great way to look at a development opportunity. If someone's a technician or operator, they may not have the opportunity to be able to be a facilitator, et cetera. So they can facilitate conversations, they can facilitate trainings and so forth. So it's an opportunity we see. We've seen the data, it shows us internally in Dow, and there's the data that's from McKinsey as well as from Deloitte that shows you that employees that are engaged in an employee resource group, if your company has those, are way more engaged and have a higher retention rate, a 40% higher retention rate, and a higher productivity rate in your companies. So our employee resource groups, and I'll give you an example of how they impact our business as well. We have 2 employee resource groups that are working together. And we just, Andrew and the team, which is actually, we were talking about this just yesterday, and Jinchan in the Seoul office, Prime and Rise. We have a reciprocal mentoring program to where those who are in their 50s or above can actually pour into and share that business savvy, that knowledge, and well-being, et cetera, to those who are just starting out in their careers and journey. And get even more granular, looking at that, our employees in Jinchan, we're looking at, they're part of Prime. We're looking at how they can mentor the younger generation who are part of Rise Employee Resource Group on financial well-being. So we look at well-being as holistically from financial, from mental, physical, and social health. So sometimes, we will get into, when you're in your 40s, when you're 45, your 50s, it's a little too late to really just to start thinking about your retirement. So this is why Prime is able to mentor, a reciprocal mentor, our Rise team. But then not only, it's not just one way down, but also then what Rise is able to do is also to share, things that are current, the digitalization and upskilling. So it's not so much reverse mentoring, but it's reciprocal mentoring, so that both groups are able to impact. That's how the employee resource groups are able to impact the business and able to impact, the employee experience, et cetera. Another aspect is if you look at how also, we look at how we can take this and partner with Dan. Dan will be one of our partners as we look at, how do we continue to hire people with disabilities in a way that they feel valued, they feel appreciated, but they also feel like they have an opportunity to come and really grow and develop once they are onboarded within Dow. So that's just a little bit of our employee resource groups. And they really do drive a lot of engagement for our company in this way. then we know that advancing inclusion, it really takes some intentional options and some intentional actions. And so just a couple of the key points here to pull out, because we would like to ask some questions or to have some questions here, to have a little bit of a dialogue. And so our business approach is really with our commitment to inclusion, diversity, and equity, really allows us to push through some of these challenging times that we've seen, especially when we've seen through COVID in the last 2.5, 3 years. We've seen some of these opportunities to really elevate, how we look at equity, et cetera. But some of these are global statistics. And, we mentioned that how we've expanded our accountabilities as part of this gets into the governance side, but around our social, where we linked our inclusion, diversity, and equity metrics to the annual performance award. A certified spend globally, again, our goal was 200 million last year, and we surpassed that and achieved 220 million. And I can tell you that 20% of that came from Asia Pacific of that spend. So a big key focus for us here. And the majority of that 20% came from South Korea. Of an overall employee satisfaction, how are your employees engaged? How are employees engaged? 71% of our employees, not just okay, but are good to great, of 71% of favorability. And also, retaining of our diverse suppliers. Again, those diverse suppliers are LGBT owned, or disability owned, or female owned, or small businesses that are making an impact in the company or in the communities where they work. So that we were able to retain 81% of our diverse suppliers, generating 99 million positivity in our bottom line. And so for every $1 million that is spent, that is able to generate with a diverse supplier, that's able to create average of 17 jobs in the community. So we think about what that can do for female-owned businesses, what that can do for people with disabilities, or what that can do for small enterprises, small businesses that can help them to grow as well. And ultimately, one of the advancements is one of the outcomes is being recognized as a leader in the job, being recognized, and Diversity Inc. is one of the top ways that we measure that. And this year we were honored to be ranked at number 15. And specifically also to talk a little bit about supplier diversity. And this is something that I think is very new in the market. It's not new globally, but it's something new in the market. But it's also there's an understanding, and this is where we have the opportunity for us, being an American company, where we have an opportunity to educate the U.S. backward. The market is still very fresh in the supplier diversity. And so we look at where we have over all of our spend, and looking at that again. The challenge for us here is that there's not as many certifying bodies, and those are typically NGOs or external organizations that will certify. For example, we have disability in the certified employees, or certified businesses or enterprises that are disability over 51% owned by a person with a disability, or 51% owned by a female. If we look at MSD, we look at WeConnect, those are two certifying bodies that really certify female owned. But one of the things and the unique opportunities that we have in Asia Pacific and in Korea as well is that also we look at the government does certify small businesses. And so again, once we spend, if you look at just average, if you spend $1 million with a diverse supplier, so you're looking at, you're intentionally spending your money with diverse suppliers that generate 17 jobs, and so that return can come back. And so that's where sometimes we talk about the circular economy. We talk about that from a product point of view, especially within plastics, but you can also look at that and how you look at that and making that impact within the economy, within where you spend your money, to look at that impact. So I think this is an opportunity, and this is an opportunity. I think we also, how we can work together with AMCHAM, with businesses, multinational symbols, with AMCHAM, and see, where are the other businesses, where are the other companies that are looking at supplier diversity? Where is there an opportunity for us to grow? And is there an opportunity with us in Asia Pacific and within Korea to look for those other certifying bodies that can help to certify other businesses around those dimensions of diversity, partnering potentially with the Disability Inc., which is an NGO based out of the US? Or is it the opportunity for AMCHAM to come together and say, we want to help to certify businesses that may be fall under one of those dimensions of diversity and help to move the needle in that way. So I really think there's an opportunity with AMCHAM, with our multinationals as well. So really just want to open it up into, and just challenge you lastly, what is your part of your ESG story? We all have an opportunity, we all have a chance to share, to do a part, but it does take intentional actions, and it does take us to be intentionally to move forward the needle. So that's just a little bit of sharing about for us at Dow. So Claire, Andrew, I'll take this time just to turn it back over to you and open it up.
So thank you so much, especially in the supplier piece. We do have a couple of questions. So let me go into the question box and read them out so that you can answer it. So first question is, I think, about regional goal versus global goal. So the question is, does Dow encourage individual regional headquarters or subsidiaries to meet IND strategy goal for Dow? Or do you have to meet ID&E goal globally each year? For example, if you have a certain office in a specific location, not meeting Dow's average ID&E inclusion, diversity, and equity goal that's set globally, would you try to make up by overreaching inclusion and diversity equity goal in other regions? Or will you try to do something specific for that region in subsequent years to make up?
Fantastic question. And I think this is a great question. I think this is a lot of times where, I think for me, my job is not only to translate global, the initiatives that we roll out globally to Asia Pacific, but it's also my job to take what we're doing in Asia Pacific and translate that back to the headquarters. So yes, for us, we do have our ID&E strategy. We have goals that are globally, but then we also have regional goals. And so I can tell you, for example, we have a global goal of reaching our employee resource group participation is at to reach 55% for this year. But I can say that in Asia Pacific, we're at 68%. That tells me that in Asia Pacific, 68% of my employees or of our employees are in the employee resource group. And our goal for this year in Asia Pacific was only 66%. So we've surpassed that goal. So yes, so we have even an IND scorecard that's just for Asia Pacific, because I think part of the journey that we've realized and that we've grown, and there's been that pivot in 2021 for our IND journey, was that we can't do a cookie cutter approach. A cookie cutter approach does not work. I'll give you another example that's tangible, is that we have a way that you can sign on and log into and join an employee resource group globally. It's one website. And when I joined Dow last year, I noticed it was all in English. And so I just jumped in and I said, wait a minute, for my region, English is not the native language. So how can you tell someone that, that we belong, but you belong not in your own language? So now that we've rolled that out into 7 different languages within the region. And so, just those inclusive practices of language being inclusive, so I have a lot of autonomy in that way of implementing our strategy in our region and looking at to see, what makes sense for our region, and bringing those voices back to global, to making sure that the voice of Asia Pacific is heard, and I think I think COVID has unfortunately been one of those barriers that has not allowed some of our global leaders to travel as much globally to get the global mindset. And so it's sometimes constantly a struggle. But yes, so we do have both global goals and we also have regional goals. Our regional goals do feed into the global goals, but for our performance award and metric as well, it's actually region by region. It's looked at a little separately because we understand the culture and the dynamics of that. So I'm really proud to say, that Asia Pacific is doing a fantastic job. And even if we look at, where Korea is, and Andrew, this is a new number for you, Korea with our ERGs, we're even at almost at 65% participation rate, which I think is just a fantastic way to show the engagement and the level of the leadership that. So we measure that site by site in the region. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Curtis. And I think if I may just add on, and depending on your sort of industry or the sector that you're in, Dow actually has a very sizable M&E operation, manufacturing operation all over the world. So when you have manufacturing operation, I think that also brings in another layer, because you have to tailor so that you meet the needs of the employees that are at the manufacturing sites. For one thing, they have different shifts, so things don't work in the same way as you do in the office. So yeah, we do have global goals, like Curtis said, but we do have to look at the different regions, countries, to see if there are any specific needs that we need to tailor for that. Second question.
One more little sense on that too is that something that in the region where I'm starting to look at more is because we are a manufacturing site, but really realizing that in Asia Pacific, females in STEM, women talent within STEM is very important. So that's something that I'm tracking in Asia Pacific specifically, that globally we're not tracking, but we're adding that into. So we're looking at, for us, we're looking at our female representation and leadership, both in our research and development, as Andrew mentioned, as well as in our manufacturing operations and in our IT functions. Seeing, are there gaps and where can we focus intentional actions? And that's an Asia Pacific specific metric that we're looking at. Thank you, Andrew, go ahead.
Very good. Second question. How formal is your country-led organizations for inclusion effort and or for resource groups or the ERGs? How formal is a global organization or resource groups? For example, is there a WIN leader in Korea? Where does she get support and direction from? And does that come from you, global WIN leader? That's the question.
Great question. I love our employee resource groups. And so for me personally, I have a passion because I helped to start in my previous company. I was actually launched one of our employee resource groups that actually has grown globally. So I have a really passionate affinity to our employee resource groups. But for how formal is our organization? Absolutely. So we have all of our employee resource groups have global leaders. Typically, most of those have co-chairs, so that it's the balance between not just one individual, but 2 or 3 individuals. So those global leaders, the ERGs, lead the direction globally, and then that cascades down into, we also have regional inclusion, our ERG leaders. So in Asia Pacific, all of our ERGs have at least 2 co-leads within the region. And then we break that down even further to every country and site, based on the site size, et cetera, has leadership as well. And so we can look at sites, maybe like, let's say for a country like for us in Philippines, we only have around 80 employees. So if we have, 8 employee resource groups, technically we could have 10 people, So what we look at in that demographic or in that geography is that really all the employee resource groups work together cohesively and maybe more focused on certain initiatives. But yes, we do have our own, for example, WIN chairs, our Women Inclusion Network chairs, both in Seoul at the Seoul office and at Jincheon. And so, so they cascade and they align together, but they also move forward with the regional and things that may be specific to the site. So they're given that autonomy. And so, and one of the keys for us is successful with our employee resource groups is with our executive sponsors. And so these are C-suite sponsors who come that can support with budget, and support with voice, and can help support with alignment on the global scale, and the regional scale, and on the local scale. So like that sponsorship is really, really, really important. It can help develop. And then for me, I help move all of our ERGs, that their voice is heard, that strategies are implemented as well, and that we align with a regional voice, with a local voice, and that ties into our global voice.
Thanks, Curtis. I actually have something for you. You covered a concept called allies when we did ERGs. So in Korea, we do have 7, but some of the ERGs, the interest or the relevance or the universe of people that we can draw from is not all that easy. GLAD is one example. MENA, Middle East and North Africa. So those 2 we have, but it's not all that easy. So we use allies to activate and to encourage what's going on there. So maybe you can sort of explain a little more on how allies work for the ERGs.
Absolutely. Allies are such an important role because allies, if you think about it, the simple translation of allies is really just a friend. It's someone who's may not identify with that specific dimension of diversity. For example, I'm an ally to our Women's Inclusion Network because I identify as a man, as a male. And so for me, I want to be able to use my voice. And sometimes if you look, well, specifically, I think we hear allies a lot with disabilities and with LGBTQ. So someone who may not have a disability or someone who may not identify as part of the LGBTQ community can use their voice, but also it's a way to educate yourself and say, you know what, I'm going to advocate for you, but I'm also going to be active both in the business and helping to implement policies, processes, but also change, but also conversations that happen. If you hear an off-candid comment that may be, in the manufacturing site, that may be on the shop floor, that may be in the office, that you're saying, wait a minute, that's not okay. Like, what if your child was someone who is disabled? Would you want someone to be speaking of that kind, or what if your sister, or what if your brother, or what if fill in the blank, the part of the LGBT community, would you be saying that to them? And so our allies really have to help move the needle and that whatever dimension of diversity it is. So allies really do play a huge role, in that, for me, I think where I really understand the allyship is for our Asia Diversity Network. Obviously, I'm not from Asia Pacific, but my partner is Asian. And for me, I just absolutely, every time we go into a meeting globally, I'm like, okay, where's our Asian representation? Where's our Asian voice? Where are we looking at that? And so that's the way that for me as an ally, I can make sure that, my region is represented. So that's the concept of allyship. It's very important.
Very good. Thanks, Curtis. I see another question just came up. The question is, as you drive ESG within Dow, what would you say is your biggest challenge?
The biggest challenge is that it's such a beast to drive. ESG is so big. There's so many components and there's so much to do. And so I really try to hone in, on that S part of it. But know that also the S part does drive, how do we also educate our ERGs? How do we educate our employees about, the environmental part, about sustainability, about decarbonization and growth? But I think not just for me as well, and not just within Dow, I think this is something that we have from the region. And we're seeing a shift in the market as well. But, for us being an American company, it's where do we find that voice, where our voice is heard? So where do we take those global initiatives sometimes, that we're pushing supplier diversity, for example, that is in the US, and we have tons of certifying bodies, and we have, a different maturity in the market in the US and in North America. But in Asia Pacific, we actually have an opportunity, we're limited with those certifying bodies that are in the market. So some of it is geography based, and so it's also, that I am able to make sure that my voice of my region is heard, that leaders like Andrew is heard, and that his concern, is able to be elevated. And so that when we do make those global strategies, and when we do have those global alignments and priorities, that the voice of the regions are heard. Therefore, that we're really moving globally. So we think globally and we also impact locally. So I think that regionalization, but we are seeing a shift in the Asia Pacific market to where now, even policies and processes that we are implementing within Asia Pacific are starting to impact the US. And so I say, hey, this is very interesting. And I can point out one really quickly, specifically around mental health and mental well-being. We just did Are You OK Day, which is an NGO based out of Australia. And so, we share that throughout our region. We had some great sessions that were held in our Korea offices and manufacturing sites around Are You OK? Elevating the questions, just asking those questions around mental health and really around suicide awareness and prevention, et cetera. So this is something that we were able to share and to develop within Asia Pacific. We brought this elevation, and now North America is asking, how did you do this? How did you implement that? So I think that's where we're starting to see a shift, with some of our American and European headquarter companies are starting to really listen to hear the voice of the region. And so, but it's still a constant challenge, I think, as well.
Thanks, Curtis. I actually have a two-part question now. So first being, any particular diversity and inclusion challenges unique to Korea, different from the rest of Asia? The second question is, any employment engagement related challenges caused by COVID? Remote working, for instance.
Okay. Yeah, I think if we look at the market in Korea, I think where we look at, and I think it's also North Asia as well, I think we still look at where it kind of can still be a little bit conservative, a little bit. So, we look at some of the gender balance as well, especially if we look at us as a manufacturing site. We still have an opportunity, I think, to have more female representation in leadership, especially if we look at some of our STEM industries. I think we still see in the South Korea market where it's still very heavily male dominated. I'm very influenced in that and very much tied into conservative thinking, and not that that's bad. It's just, what we do is we're growing. Like I said, the Gen Z and millennials are coming in and asking for more and asking for working really differently. And it kind of ties into your second question there with COVID. COVID has really elevated that, that I feel, I don't always feel comfortable coming into the office. So I think in Korea, I think we see definitely gender is one of those opportunities that will continue. And that's why we do make sure that we are tracking female representation globally or within the company as a whole, but then also looking at that, how does that also look at to leadership? Because ultimately, if we look at probably, we may have a big pool in the bottom of overall base. But then when we start to get to middle management, when we start to get to senior management, we see that female decline, especially in Korea market and Japan market as well. And we see that too in China also. And I think another opportunity is around people with disabilities. Getting that, and there's just some cultural and structural barriers that we just have to continue to move forward with and have very intentional actions. And I think we have that opportunity, but it does take intentional actions, and it takes leadership to really step out and say, I'm committed onto that. And with your question around COVID, I think what it has definitely highlighted, especially it goes back to gender. I think what it has elevated is that, oftentimes, especially in Asia, where there's still our female employees and females in general are still seen as carrying the majority of being the nurturing, the parents, that they're not just coming in, they're still coming home once they'll clock out of work and they'll go home and most of them are still the family caregivers, preparing dinner or taking care of the children, responsible. So that weight, of stress, especially around COVID, where children may still be working or schooling at home, et cetera, has really elevated. So how do we look at that? Caregiving is naturally becoming another focus in the ID&E space, specifically within Asia Pacific, but then also within the aging population. We really have to look at this within Asia Pacific. As we look at retirement ages are a little bit lower than in North America and in Europe. And so if we look at by 2050, 60%, or those who are 60 and over, will be 40% of the population within Asia Pacific. So that means that we really have to look at talent and look at how we are equipping those employees to walk into that market. But then also, are we pipelining new talent to retain those talent once we get them?
Thanks, Curtis. I forgot which month it was, but we had the big ERG Olin conference in Houston. And I just wanted maybe to ask you to introduce Olin a little bit to the audience, and also what were your sort of key takeaways from that?
Yeah, so globally, one of the things that we do is we have a global ID&E conference based in the US, because that's our headquarters. We have it in Houston, Texas, and it's called Emerge. And it's really all of our employees have the opportunity to apply for this conference. But we do limit it to 500 employees from around the world. And so it's an intentional it is a business conference around inclusion, diversity, and equity. So we bring leaders members from all over the world who are selected, and they nominate. So what's great is a business conference that actually everyone wants to be at, which is fantastic because they self-nominate. And so businesses and functions provide that. And what it does, we hear from all of the C-suite is present, from our CEO gives our opening speech, our chief HR officer, our chief inclusion officer speaks, our CFO speaks about the importance of ID&E from a holistic point of view. But really the conversation shifted this year to really about ESG. We heard from our board members saying, why they're a part of Dow board, because they believe in the inclusion and diversity and the equity practices that we're moving forward with. But then also, for me, I learned about, science is not my background. I'm a PR. I came from another company that was very, very different. And so for me, I'm on a learning journey, learning more about sustainability, learning about the impacts to the environment, and et cetera. So what happens though is this is an intentional conference that happens, and then those folks that have went there then come back to their region and they share their experience, they share their impact. And I think even in Korea, we saw a huge excitement because this is an investment in this conference into inclusion, diversity, and equity, but also it's a development opportunity. We highlighted some of our actions that were going on in the regions and so forth. And so, we saw some of our employees that come back to Korea and just exploding in our Jinja and our manufacturing site with one of our ERGs, So it really is a moment of inspiring. And then for us, the opportunity in the regions and how do we build upon that and can keep that energy as well.
Thanks, Curtis. I see that we have a minute left. I actually wanted to introduce Chiyoung Lee, CEO of Procter & Gamble, but I understand that audio is limited to people that are only on the panel. So on behalf of AMCHAM, ESG Committee, I want to welcome Chiyoung, and I'm sure she'll have another chance to address all of you. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Curtis, for your presentation. Claire, back to you. I don't know if you have any last minute things you got to do. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you so much to Curtis again for your very engaging discussion. I personally learned so much from just your dialogue and all the best practices that you shared. And I hope that the audience found the session as helpful as I did. Just a quick note, we'll have a recording of today's webinar available via our YouTube channel, so check it out. And as I mentioned earlier, ESG Committee will be holding the ESG Talk Series throughout the year, and the next one will be hosted by P&G. As Andrew mentioned, Chi-Young will be taking in charge for that. So feel free to chime in. And then if you're interested in participating as a speaker for the future ESG Talk Series, please feel free to reach out to me or Andrew regarding that. And we hope that many of you will participate in our upcoming events as well. And with that, I'd like to thank again our speakers for today, and thank you all for joining us, and hope you have a good rest of the week. Thank you.